Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, like all Americans, am very concerned about what we're seeing in social media, the impact it's having on our democracy, the disinformation that we're seeing. I have grandkids whose parents are wisely telling their kids not to get on social media. They're not giving them smartphones until they get a good deal older. But frankly, as I've listened to the conversation this morning, it strikes me that this is a story we've heard before in a different context. The idea that there are companies that are trying to give people what they want to read. Well, that's what newspapers do. And there are companies that are trying to let people hear what they want to hear. That's what radio stations do. There are TV stations that have something known as Nielsen, which tells them what people watch. And they found more salacious things, I presume, get more eyeballs. I've heard on some of the nightly shows that they can look at which guest comes in, what that guest is wearing, and they can see their ratings going up based upon the gender of the guest and what they're wearing. I mean, this is not something that's just particular to social media. It's something that's part of our entire media system. The idea that media companies, like social media companies, are trying to maximize their profitability. Well, so's TV, radio, newspapers, magazines. They're trying to stay in business and maximize their revenue. Disinformation. You ever read the National Enquirer or the Star? I mean, those are out there. They're at the newsstand. People can pick them up. There's all sorts of disinformation. How about political bias? How about Fox and MSNBC and New York Times and Washington Examiner? They have a point of view. They have a bias. And we say, well, people only have access to those sites. Well, actually, there are a lot of social media sites out there, and more are being introduced, and there will be more introduced over time. The idea that saying, hey, we're going to subject them, that we're going to break them up for antitrust reasons, don't forget, data and social media is international. It's not like it's just a U.S. enterprise. TikTok is owned by the Chinese. We're not going to break them up. Even though some of us might prefer that we could. And so we have to think about the competition coming from around the world. I must admit, I have a hard time seeing how we're going to change the algorithms. If we're going to change the algorithms for social media, how about changing the algorithms for Fox and MSNBC and the New York Times and NBC and CBS? And I mean, each of them have their own bias. They have their own way of assessing how they get the most eyeballs, how they get the most clicks, if you will, even if it's just the channel changer. I don't see how that works. Likewise, to say we're going to set the standards for what is truth and not truth. I don't know how government does that, consistent with the First Amendment. I understand why a CBS decides what they're going to show, and why a New York Times decides what they're going to print. That's their standards. And by the way, their people can respond to it, and people can boycott or stop subscribing as a result of what they're seeing. So this is an area, in my opinion, that's extraordinarily fraught for government action. And just what we can do that doesn't violate the freedom of expression which we are intent on having in our country is something which I think we have to be careful in considering. I would note that what's unusual about social media, among many things, is the precision with which data is able to be gathered and people are able to be targeted. The New York Times may say, I want to get a left of center subscriber base, but they can't get it literally down to the home to print the articles that you might want to watch. Although as they go online, and increasingly they're an online forum, they will be able to provide the articles that you want to watch and will compete on that basis. So anyway, I guess I raise a couple of things as possibilities in a topic I know very little about, but care very deeply about because of my kids and grandkids. And that is, one, to require social media companies to certify that a person who is posting or commenting is an actual person. So very simply saying, you have a responsibility as a social media company to determine if, JAB123 is actually a human being, and also what country they're from, perhaps, but whether it's a government or a corporation, but whether it's a human being. That would be number one. And that's probably the easiest constitutionally. The other is something I'd like to do. I'd like to require actually people to be identified as to who they are, what their name is, if not their address, at least their name, so people are responsible for what they post and what they comment on. I think that would fly in the face of the First Amendment and the right to be anonymous. So perhaps having more emphasis on blue checks, if you will, verifying people and really insisting that social media companies encourage more people to be identified, and perhaps even having an alternative site, which is there, if you will. There's Facebook where there's no blue check, but then there's another portion of Facebook which is all blue check. And to comment or to post, you have to have a blue check on that particular wave. And that would give people some confidence that there's a real human being that's willing to stand behind that comment. Those are the only two ideas I could come up with that I thought would be helpful here and not fly in the face of the same challenge we have with all of our media, that there's disinformation that we don't make illegal, that there's bias that we don't make illegal, that there's profit motive that we don't make illegal, that there are algorithms that draw more articles that people want to read that we don't make illegal. I don't see the course that you all are talking about as being consistent with what the rest of our media system is providing. So, don't know whether you have any comments about those ideas about that I suggest, but I'm concerned about the topic, but I just can't seem to find a way to resolve some of the problems we've described. Yeah. Dr. Priestley?
Yeah.
Can I just try real quick? Just because I worked at Nielsen, so I just want to, you're absolutely right, and I think it's great that you're pulling us back to this history of newspapers and broadcast. And what's different, I think, is that in the newspaper era, first of all, speakers didn't have this much power, and that's true in broadcast too. We had ownership restrictions. You couldn't own a newspaper and a broadcast in the same market.
But you could have the whole country like Sinclair does.
But you couldn't in the past. And so we tried to deal with some of these issues, but mostly through transparency, right? So there's a masthead.
Yeah.
There's codes and standards that you hold yourself to if you're a newspaper. If you're a broadcaster, we had the payola rules so that the DJ would have to reveal if he was being paid to play that record. The ads, the political ads that you run, you have to be transparent and say, I paid for these ads. And what we're seeing on social media, I think, is we haven't worked through those systems, so we don't have that transparency. That buyer can't beware because they just don't know who's pushing this at me, why are they pushing it at me, and the codes and standards that they proclaim, they're not really honoring.
Yeah,
the scenes,
the transparency, that's the direction I'm going, is transparency.
I think what you're talking about is really interesting. I might tweak it a little bit and say, if you're Facebook and you say you have a real name policy, then you better have a real name policy. If you have a blue, and the system of, you have a blue check mark and it says it's a human, it better be a human. If it's a bot, it should be labeled as a bot. If it's a deep fake, you need to let people know it's a fake.
Totally agree.
That is really consistent, I think, with the way we approach, with the way the industry had norms and standards in the journalist industry, and in broadcasting what the public interest standard required. It's those kinds of user empowering. Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And I agree with that. And just in terms of the differences with TV, which is that we know what Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow are saying every night. There's a record of it, and we know who was able to see it. We don't know that with speakers on the internet, right? And so that's where the transparency legislation would come in. And I attached some to my testimony because we need to figure out sort of who saw what, when, and how, right? And with television and other kinds of broadcast media and even some print media, we can figure that out, but not with social media platforms.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.